The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. In 1972, an amateur scuba diver off the coast of Calabria, Italy, noticed a hand sticking out from underneath the sea floor. Thinking at first that it was a dead body, he quickly realized that the hand was made from bronze. It turned out that this amateur scuba diver had made one of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries in recent history. Not one, but two statues lay buried there, dating from the golden age of Greek sculpture. They were 2,500 years old, and amazingly, almost perfectly preserved. They have become known as the Riace Bronzes, named after the small town in Italy where they were found. And they are considered fine examples of Greek sculptural perfection. But their importance is not confined to the history of art. They also tell us something more about the ancient Greeks. And who knows, they might even teach us something about ourselves. By the way, this video is sponsored by YouTube. We recently opened up channel memberships. You can now support us by becoming a member. You can do so by clicking the join button on the channel page. Doing so will give you some special perks and special commenting privileges. Thank you for your support. Now, back to the video. In the popular imagination, ancient Greece is the land of togas, democracy, arithmetic, poetry, and philosophy. In reality, all these popular associations come from just one period in Greek history, the so-called Golden Age of Athens, the 5th century BC, when Athens assumed political dominance after a series of Greek victories against the Persians. Almost all of the famous Greeks that you know of lived during these 100 years. Statesman Pericles, physician Hippocrates, the three playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the two great historians Thucydides and Herodotus, and of course the philosophers Socrates and Plato. As for architecture, the Parthenon was built during this time. Considering all these achievements in medicine, the arts, philosophy, science, architecture, and history, we have to wonder, what was ancient Greek society like? What brought forth this unprecedented golden age of prosperity and progress? If you imagine some kind of civilized gathering of men in togas, eloquently discussing the issues of the day, exchanging ideas in the many schools of Athens, in a sort of utopian Arcadia of peace and tranquility, you have probably been influenced by the Enlightenment Renaissance depiction of Athens. Because to honestly and truthfully consider this golden age of intellectual growth and discovery, this unprecedented accumulation of genius in time and place, we must confront the fact that ancient Greek society was very, very violent. Aeschylus is considered by many to be the father of tragedy. Out of his estimated 70 total plays, only 7 survive. But all 7 had won the prestigious first prize at the Dionysia festival in Athens, where playwrights competed for honor, glory, and recognition. Only Sophocles won more prizes, but he also wrote more plays. Pound for pound, we can reasonably say that Aeschylus was the finest Athenian playwright. Aeschylus was somewhat of an Athenian Shakespeare, and his numerous innovations to the form of tragedy include the very thing that defines tragedy. He introduced a second character on stage, and thereby introduced conflict between them. According to legend, Aeschylus died in Sicily when a flying eagle dropped a turtle on his head, instantly killing him. The eagle mistook his bald head for a rock on which to drop a turtle to break its shell. The worst part? The reason Aeschylus was outside in the first place was because he wanted to dodge a prophecy that stated that a falling object would be his demise. So, how did Athenian society commemorate this cultural icon? Keep in mind, he was very well regarded in his time. People realized his greatness. He won multiple competitions for his plays. He introduced innovations that others built upon. This was not a case of being a misunderstood genius whose brilliance is only acknowledged long after death. Aeschylus was a famous, celebrated poet. Yet, his tombstone reads as follows: "This tomb the dust of Aeschylus doth hide. Euphorion's son and fruitful Gellas' pride, how tried his valor Marathon may tell, and long-haired Medes who knew it all too well. Exactly. The tomb of Aeschylus famously makes zero mention of his prowess as a playwright. Instead, it celebrates his participation in the Battle of Marathon against the Persians. Whether the poet chose the tombstone text himself, or his friends and family did, doesn't really matter. The point is clear. Him having participated in the Battle of Marathon, a decisive Greek victory in their war against the Persians, was seen as a much more important achievement than his illustrious career as an artistic genius. And it's not like Aeschylus was a general in high command, or anything prestigious like that. He was a regular soldier, yet him being a regular soldier at his monumental battle was apparently the highlight of his life, even if he spent most of his life basically inventing tragedy. The tombstone of Aeschylus teaches us an important lesson about how the Greeks viewed life. Apparently, the biggest possible cultural achievements are worth nothing compared to even average military service. So, did the Greeks simply not care about culture? That seems like a laughable assertion. It's obvious that they cared a lot. It's just that there's something they cared about more. Much more. Violence and war. Plato's De Republic is a Socratic dialogue in which Plato, through his mouthpiece Socrates, discusses a broad range of subjects mostly centered on the nature of justice and what an ideal city-state would look like. It's one of the most important texts in history, and it deals with almost every aspect of good governance, including the education of children. You've probably heard of the Spartan agoge, the brutal training regimen mandatory for all male citizens, starting at age 7 and lasting until age 30, at which point the Spartan man was allowed to marry and start a family. Children were taught to read and write, of course, but the program focused heavily on discipline, athletics, survival skills, outwitting and deceiving others, and fostering loyalty to the Spartan state. Most notably, children were fed so little that stealing food became necessary, and theft was not punished unless you were caught in the act, teaching the children that thievery is okay and even encouraged, so long as you do not get caught. They were also only given one piece of clothing per year, so they'd become hardened to the elements. But that's Sparta. Over at Athens, surely Plato, the greatest Athenian philosopher, would disavow this kind of cruel barbarity. Except, not really. His system of the ideal education of children, as outlined in the Republic, borrows freely from both Athenian and Spartan models of education. He sought a synthesis between the literary tradition of Athens and the military one of Sparta. Most notably, he thought that for the first 10 years, physical exercise should be the prime focus of children's education. Plutarch, in his Parallel Lives, even writes that Plato fully endorsed the Spartan institution of the Crypteia, where the ablest young adults were sent into the wilderness for prolonged periods of time, in extremely harsh conditions, in order to test their mettle and see if they are worthy of Spartan leadership. And a passage in the Republic talks about the need for children to witness war in order to become more able soldiers later in life, just like how an apprentice would observe a carpenter, for example. Whether the future soldiers do or do not see war in the days of their youth is a very important matter, for the sake of which some risk may be fairly incurred. This then must be our first step, to make our children spectators of war. He does make the provision that children should ride the quickest horses on these expeditions and be accompanied by experienced veterans, and that caution should be exercised that they are not sent on really dangerous trips to the battlefield, but the point still stands. For Plato, children must be spectators of war. The reason to bring up all these examples is to hammer the point home that ancient Greek society as a whole, and not just the Spartans, really thought that physicality, athleticism, but above all violence and war were fundamental realities of the human experience. The ancient world was violent in ways that we moderns cannot fully comprehend. Violence and competition were everywhere. The Greeks had a cult of the body, They worshipped the beauty of the human body as it reached peak performance. Sports, of course, being a simulation of warfare. That's why javelin throwing contests were a thing. This cult of the body reached such extremes that statues of famous athletes were thought to have healing powers. And what this focus on violence lays bare, what it reveals about how they viewed the world, can shock the modern mind, because violence implies a hierarchy. It implies conflict, battle, war. It reveals a world of winners and losers. It reveals a world of the weak and of the strong. The Melian Dialogue is one of the highlights of the masterpiece The History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. A landmark in scientific history, this monumental work relates the story of how Athens and Sparta went to war in the 5th century BC. The episode that interests us the most is about how Athens subjugated the tiny Greek island of Melos. Its inhabitants, the Melians, claimed Spartan ancestry, but officially they were neutral in the conflict. Military leadership in Athens decided that Melos was a strategic territory, and they sent emissaries to negotiate the surrender of Melos. They were given an ultimatum: surrender or perish. Thucydides relates a dramatized version of the talks between these Athenian emissaries and the leadership of Melos. Even though he himself was not present at these talks, it is believed he truthfully relates the spirit of what was said. This conversation has become known as the Melian Dialogue. Throughout the ages, it has become regarded as a prime example of realpolitik and might is right morality. And perhaps like no other text does it tell us about the mindset of Athenians at this time. In short, the Athenians are here to tell Melos that they're going to be conquered, like it or not. They say it would be foolish to resist, considering the military superiority of Athens. And, most importantly, they will not waste time explaining their reasoning, or coming up with a flimsy justification for this war. Athens is going to conquer Melos, because Melos is weak and Athens is strong. We shall not trouble you with specious pretenses, either of how we have a right to our empire because we overthrew the Mede, or are now attacking you because of the wrong that you have done us, and make a long speech that would not be believed. Since you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equal of power, while the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. There are some geopolitical considerations, of course. Melos cannot be independent because Athens thinks it would reflect badly on their own power, and it might inspire rebellions in other parts of their empire. But such considerations take second stage. The fact of the matter is, Athens is going to rule because Athens is superior. Such is the way of the world, of gods and of men. Of the gods we believe, and of men we know, that by a necessary law of their nature they rule wherever they can. And it is not as if we were the first to make this law, or to act upon it when made. We found it existing before us, and will leave it to exist forever after us. All we do is to make use of it, knowing that you and everybody else, having the same power as we have, would do the same as we do. As it happened, Melos did not surrender to Athens, and chose to fight instead. And sure enough, they were conquered. Just as promised, Melos was completely annihilated. Athens killed the men and sold the women and children into slavery. The Melian Dialogue, perhaps like no other text, exemplifies the reigning morality of the Greeks, and it showcases how central violence was to the Greek worldview, and how different their morality was from ours. If you want more of a deep dive into this dialogue, we've also touched upon it in our video on why Nietzsche loved Thucydides. There's a link in the description. And that brings us back to the Riace Bronzes. What do these sculptures tell us about ancient Greece? They are significant because they represent both sides of the Athenian spectrum. They couple the highest achievements in culture and art and aesthetics with the violent, warlike, militaristic ethos that defined the ancient Greek worldview. They confront us with a strange reality. They represent a synthesis between two opposites, at least opposites from our modern post-Christian perspective. The opposites of violent barbarity and peaceful culture. We tend to believe that one flourishes at the expense of the other, that they can't both exist at the same time. But for the Greeks, Evidently, this was not the case. Aeschylus is the father of tragedy, a titan of culture who changed the course of artistic history, yet whose tombstone makes no mention of his monumental achievements in the arts, but only mentions his participation in a bloody conflict. Plato talked about the nature of the good, of beauty, of justice. He wrote comprehensively on a variety of subjects. He wrote about the soul of the afterlife, the nature of reality, the definition of knowledge, about politics and education. An intellectual giant, perhaps with no equal in world history. Yet how did he want children to be educated? By becoming spectators of war, by being taken to the battlefield to see with their own eyes the realities of war. Not to discourage them from a martial life, but to ensure that they'd become better soldiers for it. Thucydides, the Athenian general and historian, wrote about a conflict taking place right during the golden age of Athens, this high point of culture, philosophy, mathematics, and science. But how do the Athenians wage war? Not with any justification in mind, not for the betterment of humanity or out of self-defense. No, the Athenians completely annihilated the neutral island of Melos and didn't even bother to come up with an excuse. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. These contradictions, strange as they are to the modern mind, become crystallized when we look at these bronze statues depicting two ancient warriors. They stand in the famous contrapposto stance. They represent the high point in the evolution of Greek sculpture, where the human form was perfected, every detail meticulously sculpted right down to minuscule muscles and barely noticeable veins in the arms. Every muscle perfectly proportioned, the body depicted in motion. People who go visit this pair of statues are always deeply impressed. Some are even disturbed by it. The British sculptor Elizabeth Frink, who was fascinated by the bronzes, called them very beautiful but also very sinister. A writer for a British magazine once described his visit to the bronzes as follows: "My instinctive reaction was alarm. The two sculptures are an extraordinary intellectual and artistic accomplishment, but they visibly came from a violent and terrible world, which is what the Mediterranean has so often been." Peter Hitchens also weighed in and shared this assessment. Far more than other survivors from the ancient Greek era, these statues appear to me to speak directly to us. Bronze, which survived so rarely, seems to be much more expressive than marble. They almost vibrate with power and violence. They are, in my view, extremely disturbing. To Peter Hitchens, these statues represent the old world, the pre-Christian world. This was a world in which Christianity was yet to come, a harsher, crueler, more immediately violent, capricious and fatalistic world than the one we know, and a very frightening one. And it is this sinister, dark aspect to them that cuts to the core of the effect of the bronzes on the modern mind. They remind us of the violence that lay beneath the cultural achievements of ancient Greece, a reminder that makes us deeply uncomfortable. Could it be that violence is a necessary part of human flourishing? That is the forbidden question that the bronzes ask us. In many ways, to ask the question is to answer it. It forces us to think about the last 3,000 years of human history and the impact of Christianity on our worldview, and it pushes us to the limits of modern acceptability. Nietzsche greatly admired this period of ancient Greek excellence, and in many ways sought to return to a morality like the Greek one amid the ruins of the post-death of God world. The passing of Christianity would provide the potential for a return of Greek morality, just as the Renaissance had been a literal rebirth of ancient values against Christianity. Cesare Borgia as Pope: could we imagine such a thing? Would we allow it? And what good and what bad would come of it? Despite the fact that Christianity seems to be on the way out, it seems like the world of the Riace Bronzes is still far too alien for us. And if we, as humans, as a civilization, will ever try to rekindle that ancient Greek spark, it seems like something else must happen first. And that something makes us confront the ugly part of our nature, or rather, the part of our nature that we have been taught is ugly. The violent, capricious, subterranean part, the Machiavellian, power-hungry, shadow side of ourselves. because what the Bronzes teach us is that this shadow of violence is somehow interlinked with the light of culture and human excellence. I want to close off with a quotation from Nietzsche's most forward-looking work, the prophetic Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a passage about so-called higher men, the Übermensch, and the necessity of his embrace of power, violence, and even evil. Man is evil, so said to me for consolation all the wisest ones. Ah, if only it be still true today, for the evil is man's best force. Man must become better and eviler, so do I teach. The evilest is necessary for the Superman's best. It may have been well for the preacher of the petty people to suffer and be burdened by men's sin. I, however, rejoice in great sin as my great consolation. Such things, however, are not said for long ears. Every word also is not suited for every mouth. These are fine faraway things, at them sheep's claws shall not grasp. Hurry up for the task. Only time will tell. Thank you for watching. A big thank you goes out to our Patreons who make these videos possible. Consider joining their ranks if you think these videos are valuable and if you want to support our work. Another way to support the channel is by becoming a channel member. We recently opened up memberships and we're going to add some extra goodies for people who sign up for them. Not quite like the Patreon, but we want to give people more options to support us. Some people aren't comfortable with Patreon and would prefer to stay on YouTube. This is for you. As always, thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.